We have just two more lectures before I leave you, and those of you who are staying on have a wonderful cruise through the Caribbean. You'll have new lecturers. I have no idea who, in case that question comes up. So we're going to talk today, going to continue the discussion of the history of humans in space. We talked yesterday the early pioneers, the Russian Tsiolkovsky, Hermann Oberth, the German, and Dr. Robert Goddard, the American. Now we're going to pick up, we're going to quickly review Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin and go through there for the American and Russian programs. See if I can figure out how to get rid of this. Wonder what that does. That didn't do anything. Okay, let's try this. There we go. So here we go. Let's talk about, of course, Russia changed the world in October the 4th, 1957, with Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite launch. And here is the Sputnik satellite that lasted for roughly 6 months or so before it re-entered the atmosphere, but caused a tremendous amount of excitement and, frankly, some fear in the West. It actually shocked the world, started the space race. If for those of you like me who are little history buffs, there was a geophysical science year in 1957, and our then President Dwight David Eisenhower had begun with some of the other nations, mostly Western European nations, Germany, Britain, etc., developing a rocket to send a spacecraft into Earth orbit. And of course, the Russians were there first. Notice these headlines. Space age is here. Satellite heard by thousand. Russia wins the race into outer space. Red moon over London. That was the next day, October the 5th, 1957. So we talked about how we were very concerned in the United States that the Russians had more powerful rockets. They could actually send a satellite into space. And immediately in November of 1957, the Russians sent one of their dogs, Laika, this is 1 month later, into space. And part of the rationale for that was, how can animals live in space? We had no knowledge of the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system. What we knew, there would be no gravity up there because you're free falling around the Earth, and we didn't have any way to predict how the human body would react to zero gravity. So Laika was the first animal in space. Notice Laika's spacesuit. Here's the helmet. That's where her paws went, and this was a pressurized suit for Laika to travel in this spacecraft. Now, it turns out that there was no re-entry system. So Laika was satellite, did not return to Earth, so she was the first sacrificed animal, I guess. But the Russians, of course, had her body instrumented so we could measure the heartbeat, heart pressure, those type of things. So we knew that an animal could survive in space. And then in November of 1960, the Strelka, a separate dog, was launched, and by this time the Russians did have a re-entry system and a capsule that could land on Earth. And interestingly enough, Nikita Khrushchev visited Washington, D.C. JFK, John Kennedy, was president, and Strelka came back. She had puppies, and one of those puppies was given to Caroline Kennedy by Khrushchev in 1961 as a gift. Now, Americans also were intending to send humans into space, and we began with a similar program. In January of 1961, we had the first suborbital launch on the Mercury Redstone in what would later become the Mercury capsule that carried Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom. And Ham was the first chimpanzee to launch into orbit by America, followed by Enos in November of 1961, and we were able to determine that they could survive. But remember, this was only about a 20-minute suborbital flight. Now, the chimpanzees were trained to do certain tasks once they got into orbit, to punch certain buttons with a key-coded light, and that would give them candy or treats, and we wanted to see how were their motor skills working in space. Now, Ham was not a very happy camper. The G-forces of re-entry for the Mercury capsule were 8 to 9 times gravity. We limit our fighter pilots, because we don't want them to black out, even with special G suits and special training, to 9 Gs. Very, very difficult. And when they opened the capsule, recovered it, put it on the aircraft carrier, the first thing Ham did was bite the hand of his handler, who was trying to undo his seatbelt. So Ham was not a very happy chimpanzee. Russia stuns the world again with the first human into orbit. And of course, this was Yuri Gagarin on April the 12th, 1961. Notice the Soyuz launcher has a more powerful second stage. This is the capsule. Gagarin is inside here in an ejection seat. These are communications antennas. These are gases and propulsion to put it into orbit, and then to turn around and take away just 200 or 300 miles per hour is all it takes for you to descend out of orbit. It puts your trajectory where it's going to intercept the atmosphere. Then the heat shield takes away the heat of re-entry, slows you down, finally with the spacecraft parachuting into Kazakhstan and landing. Here's Sergei Korolev. I talked about the chief designer, and we did not learn his identity until late into the 1970s. And he was a very gifted engineer, much like he's the equivalent of Wernher von Braun to the Russian space program. And he learned very early to build rockets and build model airplanes. Interestingly enough, I think it was 1936 or 37, Stalin, they had some trumped up charges, and they sent Korolev to the Gulag for 3 or 4 years. He and another famous Russian rocket scientist who built their engines, Glushko, both served in gulags for 3 or 4 years. And then the Soviets realized that these men were too valuable after World War II and let them out. Sergei Korolev basically led the Russian space program, the human spaceflight program, and development of their large rockets up through his death in 1966. Interestingly enough, these are called the Sochi 7. It's a Black Sea resort, Sochi. These are their 7 astronauts right here. Here's Yuri Gagarin and training officers. What's interesting is later, Nelyubov, who is right here, was removed from their cosmonaut corps for bad behavior, and this is one of the rare pictures that shows Nelyubov in the picture, which was later airbrushed out. And so you can go on the internet and find the airbrushed picture, and this cosmonaut is removed. Then NASA moved on and selected 7 Mercury astronauts in 1959 from 110 military pilots. They wanted highly trained military test pilots to do this very unique job. And of course, on the front row, we have Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Dick Slayton, and Gordon Cooper. Here's John Glenn, Wally Schirra, and in the back row, Alan Shepard. These are all Type 1A personality, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, steely-eyed rocket scientists, test pilots, extremely competitive, and there was an incredible competition to see who would fly first. It would turn out to be Alan Shepard in May of 1961, followed by Gus Grissom, both on suborbital flights, and then finally the first American to orbit was John Glenn in Friendship 7. So we'll show you some about the Mercury capsule. First, look at this cutaway, and many of the Edwards Air Force Base test pilots felt like they had been asked if they'd be interested. I'm trying to remember, I just had a mental block, the guy who exceeded the speed of sound in 1947 in Glamorous Glenner. Yes, Yeager. Yeager had been asked if he would be interested in flying into space, and basically his answer was, no, those guys aren't really pilots, they're spam in a can. And initially in the design, the Mercury capsule did not even have a window. So, you know, Yeager goes, no, that's not flying. I'm a real pilot. Let me show you about real flying. But here's the cutaway, very tight quarters. They roll jets. They did have a periscope initially. Their main and reserve parachutes, vacuum packed, weight is critical. The drogue chute that comes out after we get down into the atmosphere, about 50,000 feet. Then the drogue chute slows the capsule down, stabilizes the capsule. You cannot deploy a large parachute at very high velocities. If it comes out and inflates, it will just shred. So you have stages. The drogue chute first, that is much, much smaller, but slows you down. Then the main parachute comes out, and we have what are called reefing lines that only allow the first 1/3 to inflate, and then begins to slow some more. The second reefing line comes out, 2/3 inflate, and finally full inflation. And we still use that technique for heavy payloads that we're parachuting to Earth today. Horizon sensors, the heat shield is here. The retro rockets right here. Here's the retro rocket, and they are solid rocket motors, 3 of them, relatively small. And in order to take the capsule out of orbit, that required the very large Atlas ICBM, you turned it around so that now you're firing in the opposite direction that you're going, which slows the spacecraft. You have to be in a specific attitude to get your velocity vector correct, and you have to be at the right place over Earth so that the objective is to come down close enough to the recovery aircraft carrier that you can get picked up and not sit there for a long time. The escape rocket is here, and here's some of the other components. This capsule design was designed by Max Fouget, who was my engineering director still at the Johnson Space Center in 1975 when I went there. Very, very interesting man, kind of short, very, very smart, very thin, and he picked this shape. Let's go back for just a minute. Yuri Gagarin's shape was this shape, more like a ball. The American capsule has this particular shape, a truncated cone, because no matter if I had the heat shield toward the atmosphere, even slight perturbations of the atmosphere, this shape allows it to recover and be stable without having very serious jets on it. If you re-entered with the forward part first, you would burn up and die. So you must have the heat shield. After these solid rockets fired 1, 2, 3, you jettison the solid rocket package, then you have the heat shield blunt end first to re-enter. We, of course, tested these capsules. One of them is called Little Joe, out in the White Sands Proving Grounds near Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. Notice it's a significant rocket. It's a liquid-fueled rocket, but it is not large enough to send the capsule into space. All this purpose of this test was to test the emergency escape rockets, where if the booster had a failure and then either the pilot or the ground could command these rockets to fire. We would blow the bolts right here, and we would pull the capsule away from a malfunctioning booster. Then the parachutes would deploy, and the astronauts could safely return. On the last test flight of Little Joe, the vehicle started rolling because there was something wrong in the computer flight control system. And then all of a sudden, the whole booster broke up, and the trigger to fire this rocket was a wire connecting these two stages. And when the Little Joe rocket broke up, it actually initiated the escape sequence, an unplanned test, but the most realistic test that we could possibly do, and it successfully survived the booster breakup and explosion. The Redstone rocket, not large enough to go into orbit, a direct derivative of von Braun's V2, flew in 1960 unmanned, and then Ham the chimpanzee, January 61. All the time, the big Atlas, which is large enough to send the Mercury capsule into orbit, is being tested unmanned at the same time. The first three, notice we use a numbering system called MA, means Mercury, the capsule, Atlas, the booster. This was called MR, Mercury, the capsule, Redstone, the booster. The astronauts watched three of these first flights fail. While the astronauts are watching, I found it quite extraordinary that anybody would get into one of these after watching them blow up shortly after they lifted off the pad. Not a good sign. Of course, von Braun and his team developed the Mercury Redstone, and the Atlas was built by General Dynamics out in San Diego as our first intercontinental ballistic missile. Here's the liftoff, only 78,000 pounds of thrust, relatively small for a rocket engine. So in order for it to lift off, this entire rocket with all its propellant has to weigh less than the thrust of the engine, or it doesn't lift off. It's not like an airplane where you have wings to allow it to climb to higher altitudes. What we call the thrust to weight ratio must be greater than 1 for you to lift off and climb into the air. Here's Alan Shepard taking off, and his first suborbital flight, a 15-minute flight, landing several hundred miles east of the Kennedy Space Center. Not actually, probably late tomorrow or tonight, will be reasonably close to the area where some of these boosters fell into the water as we approach Fort Lauderdale. Be a little bit south of there, but not a whole lot. Then Gus Grissom takes off in Liberty Bell 7. I actually flew this type of helicopter in Germany after a year of combat flying Chinooks in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division. These were built by Sikorsky in 1955 through about 1958. They were still flying in 1969 when I went to Germany. So here, this was about as heavy a lift as a helicopter that we had at the time. Big piston engine in the front, 1,400 shaft horsepower. Turns out this is the exact same engine that powered the B-17 in World War II, and this is called the CH-34 Choctaw. What happened, though, they tested a new explosive hatch. In other words, if the pilot inside, he could pull a certain lever like an ejection lever, it would activate explosives that would blow this hatch off. Gus Grissom claims, and I have no reason to doubt him, that he never touched that lever and this hatch exploded by itself. Perhaps it did. We were never able to reproduce that failure on the ground. But what happened was, now Gus has to come out. He has his faceplate off and his helmet off. The capsule, as long as the hatch is there, would float. Once the hatch was blown off, water started coming in. Water started going into Gus's hat, or into his suit. So he's in this giant hip boots, if you will, taking on water, struggling in the water to survive. The first helicopter's trying to recover the valuable capsule so we can understand and inspect its systems, see how it worked. Here's Gus over here going blub, 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 blub. Finally, the second recovery helicopter recognized he was in trouble, went over, picked him up. He very nearly drowned, but we've thankfully picked him up. As the Liberty Bell 7 filled with water, it was too heavy for the helicopter to lift. He got warning lights. You're pulling too much power. He had to release the capsule. Sometime in the 80s or 90s, they knew where this capsule was, found it by sonar, and they recovered it. And I think it may be in a museum in St. Louis somewhere, which is where these capsules were built. Quite a remarkable story. So Gus, the next time he flew, he named his spacecraft the Unsinkable Molly Brown, after the Titanic, story. But Russia continues to upstage America. Vostok 2, German Titov. He went into space for an entire day. Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom flew a month or two before this. Now Titov, in the second manned launch of the Soviets, they completed 17 orbits. An entire day. America has not even put one U.S. astronaut into Earth orbit for even one orbit, let alone 17 in an entire day. Titov, also like Gagarin, he ejects and he lands safely, even though his service module failed to separate from the reentry. The Soviets designed their system that if the service module, which provided the propulsion and the breathing air and the power systems, if it didn't come off, it would still have the heat shield down. And although that burned off and caused a lot of trouble, Titov landed safely, thankfully. Our first ICBM, the Atlas, flew in October of 1959, and it was a very powerful rocket, and it was the first one that had enough power to put the Mercury capsule into Earth orbit. And here's John Herschel Glenn Jr., becomes the first American to orbit the Earth in February 1962, almost a year later than Yuri Gagarin, and Titov has already flown 17 orbits. But here's John Glenn entering the Freedom 7, up on top of the pad, and the mighty Atlas ICBM lifting off, and he completed 3 orbits. This was the 6th flight, MA Mercury Atlas 6. The first 5 were unmanned. The 5th one was successful. 3 of the first 5 exploded before their capsules went into orbit. So this was risky business early in the game, thus test pilots. Scott Carpenter, who was the only one who was not a test pilot, he went up into orbit in May of 1962. Also 3 orbits, only 3 for the early. We only had enough battery power and atmospheric conditioning, oxygen, take the carbon dioxide out, for 3 orbits. So Titov's 17 orbit flight was a very, very significant milestone that we wouldn't exceed until we got very late in the program, added electrical power, oxygen. Scott was a bit of a, what shall I say, artist rather than a test pilot. About halfway through his flight, he was maneuvering the spacecraft, watching all the pretty fireflies, looking at the stars. The ground calls him, and they said, "You're using too much maneuvering fuel. Stop using the maneuvering fuel," because you had to have enough fuel at the end of your 3rd orbit to turn the capsule around in the proper attitude, fire your rockets, and then hit the reentry point where the recovery ship was. Scott ignored them. That made Dr. Christopher Columbus Kraft, who was the flight director, not a happy camper. And Dr. Kraft later became our center director, and he called all the shots as the flight director. Scott ran out of fuel, did not maneuver to the proper attitude for re-entry, was close enough, thankfully, that he re-entered, but he missed the landing area by 250 nautical miles, And he spent 40 minutes out there. We had no idea where he was. Dr. Kraft, the flight director, goes, "We have lost the first American in space." Actually, they were quite happy to find him, but because Scott Carpenter didn't pay attention to what the ground told him to do, it's like disobeying a direct command, he never flew in space again. And so whatever you want to conclude from that is fine, but there was a reason for the ground to tell him to stop using up his maneuvering fuel. Russia launches Vostok 3 and 4 now. They are on the same path that we are. We're very early in our program. The Russians are trying to figure out, how do I rendezvous in space? One of the first things you have to do before you go to the moon is you have to learn to rendezvous and dock with other spacecraft, so that when you do go to the moon, then you undock, descend to the moon's surface, come back up from the moon, rendezvous and dock with the command and service module that Michael Collins is in on Apollo 11, and then you begin the return trip back to Earth. So learning the skills of targeting two spacecraft to launch and to rendezvous in space and then to dock in space was very valuable and a needed thing. One of the things, we had a checklist of things you must do before you go to the moon. First one is rendezvous, dock, and then continue on learning how to maneuver spacecraft. The Russians on Vostok 3 and 4 launched two single cosmonaut piloted spacecraft. They come within 64, they orbited 64 times, a huge leap. We didn't do that again until 1965. And they came within 4 miles of each other, but we're still learning, and the velocities weren't exactly right. They didn't have enough maneuvering fuel, but each time that they're trying this, we're learning new techniques. Wally Schirra now begins flying longer, Sigma 7, 9 hours, 7 orbits. So we went the first 2 times, 3 orbits each. Now Wally flies the third Mercury Atlas, and he lands within 1/2 mile of the USS Kearsarge. The tremendous difference between Wally Schirra is he was really a by-the-book guy. He did everything exactly like the flight plan. He still had, when his spacecraft was recovered and landed on the aircraft carrier, over 60% of his maneuvering fuel left. So he was not going to take any chances like Scott Carpenter did. Gordon Cooper flies Faith 7. Now we're increasing, 22 orbits, 34 hours. We had to put extra batteries, extra oxygen tanks to extend the mission. At the end of his 22nd orbit, the flight control system, the computer failed, and Gordon Cooper executed a perfect manual reentry. They were trained for that failure, and he landed within 1/2 mile of his recovery aircraft carrier. There was some concern that he was so close and so precise that they might land the spacecraft on the carrier. And the captain, as it's coming down, he actually turned the aircraft carrier away from the spacecraft, so we didn't want it landing on the deck and crunching. And it needed to land in the water to help cushion the landing so that the astronauts could survive. The Russians always landed on land because they didn't own warm water ports. So they generally, and to this day, the Russians land on the land. Again, Russia continues to lead. Vostok 5, Bilkovsky, in June of 1963. He had a problem with his booster. It was lower than planned orbits, but still successful. Then the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, flew Vostok 6. She was the only woman until Sally Ride, much, much later, to go into space on the space shuttle. She was a champion parachutist, and the Russians are very big on first things. First launch, first rendezvous, longest flight, first woman in space. I had the great opportunity of meeting Valentina in Moscow in 2001 at the 40th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's first flight in 1961. Quite a very capable and lovely woman. Now Russia does another first. They launched the first three-man crew in a brand new capsule. Komarov, Fyokistov, and Boris Vegorov fly without their spacesuits in a very cramped Voskhod capsule. It was modified. It did not have ejection seats, but they didn't have enough room to carry their spacesuits. On a later launch, this would come back to haunt the Russians, and they have never launched without spacesuits in a spacecraft again. I'll tell you about it in just a moment. Alexei Leonov in 1965. The Russians had intelligence that America planned to do the first spacewalk. In other words, open the Gemini capsule. We haven't flown it yet. And we were going to put Ed White out and let him maneuver in space. So the Russians developed their system, and Alexei Leonov was the first to step out into space. And they did have a control failure, and they spent the cold night alone, 22 degrees below zero in Siberia, before the rescue party arrived on skis the next day. While they were there, a pack of wolves were threatening them. They kind of retreated into the spacecraft, but from then on, the Russians always put a weapon, a powerful pistol, inside their spacecraft in case they had to land, and it was delayed recovery. It didn't happen, but at least they could shoot the wolves, I guess. So we moved from Mercury to Gemini, 2 crew members, a cutaway again, same fundamental design, a big difference. Gemini is going to maneuver in space and spend much longer in space. So we added, this is called the service module, which has the propellant, fuel, and oxidizer tanks for its engine, has more oxygen. We first flew fuel cells that convert liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen into electricity through a catalyst, and the byproduct is electricity that's very useful, and pure water so that the astronauts could drink it. It's very, very pure. So fuel cells were designed to lengthen the time. We use a new booster now. This is the Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile, and it was used 10 times successfully for the Gemini missions between 1965 1966. The first flight of Gemini was by Gus Grissom and John Young. John Young was the only astronaut to ever fly 3 different spacecraft. He was the first pilot with Gus Grissom, the commander, on the Gemini. He later flew to the moon on the Apollo and landed on the moon. And he was the command pilot with Bob Crippen for the first space shuttle launch. John is still alive, fabulous character, great Navy guy, and they flew the first in March 65, 3 orbits, test flight. We know that the Gemini can last longer, but you want to prove the brand new spacecraft systems in orbit before you commit it to long missions. Then Gemini 4 carried Jim McDivitt and Ed White, 66 orbits of flight, a 4-day flight. Now we're starting to approach the Russians' capability that they had demonstrated. We're still ahead 2 years earlier. So we now begin to close the gap. Ed White does conduct the first American spacewalk, but Alexei Leonov had created the first one, the Russian spacewalk, first one to walk in space. Here's a picture of Ed White. The Gemini spacecraft had ejection seats, but each hatch had to be opened, so before Ed could go outside, Jim McDivitt, the commander over here on the left, had to be in his pressure suit, in his spacesuit, just like Ed White, because when Ed opened the door to go outside, the whole spacecraft is depressurized. Gemini 5, Gordy Cooper and Pete Conrad fly an 8-day, 120-orbit flight. We're really proving the systems. The ground team has now learned and trained to work around several problems, including a fuel cell shutdown, restart, a failed thruster, replan of the rendezvous procedure, cold spacecraft. So the ground team is learning how some of these failures might happen. They are actually trained and planned for them. We did simulations hours and hours and hours and simulated certain failures. We used to call him the sim supervisor for prior to the first shuttle launch. I spent a lot of time in the control center, and the sim supervisor, we called him evil, because he dreamed up failures and the flight control team never knew what the failure was. We had to go figure out what it was, figure out the proper workarounds. Some of them would be new and unusual that there were no checklists for. After the simulation, if you didn't, even if you got it right, there was a debriefing where the simulation team would try to explain what was the failure they introduced, why were they introducing that failure, and how did the ground team identify and react to it. So both the flight teams and the ground teams are working very closely together. Gemini 7, Jim Lovell flew Apollo 13, and by the way, when I talk about that tomorrow, the Apollo 13 movie was as close to what really went on as probably Hollywood can do. Frank Borman, December 65. We were supposed to actually rendezvous and dock with an Atlas Agena, a separate rocket launched the day before that would go up, and it had a docking adapter so that the Gemini 7 could come up and physically dock with it. That launch vehicle failed, and what we ended up doing was flying Gemini 6 and 7, two spacecraft together, and we successfully completed rendezvous and flying in formation. This is what the Russians were trying to do on Vostok 3 and 4. We have properly phased the burns and learned how to rendezvous, and then one of them, Gemini 7, completed 14 days living in something smaller than the little closet that we used to go to the bathroom in. And they spent 14 days here, no bathing, no shaving. You know, it was a grueling fight. They said the last 3 days you just did it on pure guts and endurance. But we were trying to simulate how do the crew react to 14-day missions, round trip to the moon. Gemini 6, Wally Schirra, Tom Stafford, they launched in 1965. And this crew, their Atlas Agena, here it is, the docking capsule's up here. This booster failed, and so after their rocket started up but shut down, Wally and Tom Stafford are in the spacecraft, fully fueled. They're sitting on a bomb. They have Wally is cool. He doesn't hit the eject system. They stay with it, and we were later able to check out the aircraft and fly it a few weeks later with Gemini 7 in December, completing the previous pictures of the rendezvous in space. That was not the original plan, so we replanned it. Gemini 8, might recognize this guy, Neil Armstrong. Here's his Atlas Agena. Here he is performing the first physical docking in space. Armstrong and Dave Scott had one of their jets on their Gemini spacecraft fail in the open position. And the spacecraft with the docked Agena started to spin, slowly at first, but this jet is on all the time. So the spin rate is accelerating. Neil Armstrong, who's the commander, coolest cucumber I've ever been around in my life, had a bunch of different failures to deal with. Undocks, emergency undock, backs the Gemini capsule off. He can't see which jet is on, nor do his system tell him which jet is on. As soon as he does that, the Gemini spacecraft spins up so rapidly in the next couple of minutes that they almost blacked out from high G's. And what Neil Armstrong did was he shut down, closed the valves of all of the spacecraft's reaction control system that stopped the failed-on jet. Then he activated the emergency backup reentry jet system. But once you do that, you're committed to abort the mission, and we aborted the mission, landed in space. But the whole team learned valuable lessons. One of our engineering lessons is if you lost power to the jet, it would not come on. In other words, the valves required power to stay open. So, and what happened, this jet had lost power, but that opened the valves and allowed the jet to fire continuously. Gemini 9, Tom Stafford, Gene Cernan, the last astronaut to walk on the moon. They flew, their docking system had what's called the Angry Alligator. They conducted spacewalks, no handholds, didn't know that we would become exhausted in space, and we learned valuable lessons that later led to handholds to do jobs outside of a spacecraft and training in neutral buoyancy, big swimming pools. Here's Gene, almost nearly exhausted, 180 plus heart rate. His visor fogged up from breathing when Tom Stafford aborts the mission, says, "Come back in, Gene, we can't do that." John Young on Gemini 10 with Mike Collins. Mike Collins would later pilot the command and service module, the Eagle, around the moon. They fly the last Gemini, and they do valuable testing, including docking, reboosting with a docked space system. So all of these things have been written down. We must prove these tasks, techniques, and systems, and as you check them off, you move and replan the next mission. But we are accelerating to go to the moon and return safely in this decade. So we're 1966 now. We're only 4 years to the end of the decade. 3 years after this is when Apollo 11 landed. We were flying these missions about every 6 weeks. So there was always a crew in training, always a different flight control team in training, and these things are overlapping. And if you're successful, you don't have to replan the mission. Gemini 11, I'm sorry I said the last one, it wasn't. Here's Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon. They rendezvous with their Agena on the first stage. Now what we're doing is called, instead of going up and phasing and taking 5 or 6 orbits, they wait for their target to go right over the Kennedy Space Center and do what's called a direct ascent, and they rendezvous and dock on the very first orbit. Takes incredible precision to do that. They also boosted to a new altitude record, 850 miles above the Earth. Gemini 12, the last one, Jim Lovell, Buzz Aldrin. It was the last flight. It proved this new spacewalk technique of providing handholds so that the astronauts could move around from their seat around to the back. Also foot restraints, so they could put their boots, their space boots, and now have something to react to be able to do simple, different type of tasks that we were learning to do that we knew we would have to use in Apollo. That's why we did them. Now, Buzz Aldrin, who was a rendezvous and docking specialist, successfully proved that these new techniques and the training in the water would be successful, and they conduct an automatic re-entry, and now NASA is ready to go to the moon. So that's the view of what the Russians were doing early in their manned space program, and what we were doing in Mercury and Gemini to build the experience, both ground flight teams, contractor teams who build the hardware, taking each of these steps one step at a time. Started with baby steps, and then we started doing bigger steps until I'll tell you tomorrow about Apollo 8, which was a huge, huge step. And then, of course, Apollo 11, that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. I think I have time for a couple of questions. Anybody over here? Right here, yes, sir.